Hello, it is a big day, a significant day for all of us at the Atlantic Council and for our friends at the German Marshall Fund. It is a great pleasure to host the NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg for his reflections on the alliance's future. We are delighted to be partnering with our colleagues at the German Marshall Fund of the United States and with NATO Public Diplomacy to bring you a conversation with the Secretary General of NATO for the launch of the alliance's reflection process, evaluating how to strengthen NATO in an increasingly competitive world. We're having this conversation as the world confronts the worst pandemic in a century and the deepest economic downturn since the Great Depression. And here in the United States, we're also facing the most widespread anti-racist protests in 50 years. We at the Atlantic Council are responding by doubling down on our founding purpose to advance a more equal, just, prosperous, and collaborative international order. And of course, the NATO alliance has always been at the center of our work and the center of that purpose. Thank you for joining us today from all around the world for this important discussion.
At a time when citizens in NATO countries are looking for leadership, they need look no further than NATO headquarters, where Secretary General Stoltenberg is providing strong, principled, and decisive leadership. It is my sincere pleasure to welcome Jens Stoltenberg, NATO's Secretary General, to the stage. Mr. Secretary General, over to you.
Good afternoon from Brussels and good morning to Karen and Fred in Washington, and welcome to all who are following us online. Last December, NATO leaders asked me to make our strong alliance even stronger by making sure we are as effective politically as we are militarily, and that we remain ready today to tackle the challenges of tomorrow. This is an opportunity to reflect on where we see our alliance 10 years from now, and how it will continue to keep us safe in a more uncertain world. So today I am happy to launch my reflection on NATO 2030. COVID-19 has changed our lives in ways we could barely imagine, and it has magnified existing trends and tensions when it comes to our security. Russia continues its military activities unabated. ISIL and other terrorist groups are emboldened. Both state and non-state actors promote disinformation and propaganda. And the rise of China is fundamentally shifting the global balance of power, heating up the race for economic and technological supremacy, multiplying the threats to open societies and individual freedoms, and increasing the competition over our values and our way of life. NATO 2030 is about how we adapt to this new normal. And to do this, we must stay strong militarily, be more united politically, and take a broader approach globally. So first, we need a strong military alliance to protect our democracies and to continue to compete in a more competitive world. Threats to our security have not gone away while we are focusing on the pandemic, just the opposite. As we look to 2030, we must continue to invest in our armed forces and modern military capabilities. They have kept us safe for over 70 years, as they continue to do today. Security is the foundation for our prosperity now and in the future. But military strength is only part of the answer. We also need to use NATO more politically. This means bringing all the issues that affect our security to NATO's table, so that we can forge stronger consensus sooner and more systematically. From conflicts in the wider Middle East region to global arms control and the security consequences of climate change. Using NATO more politically also means using a broader range of tools, military and non-military, economic and diplomatic. This is especially important as we work together to strengthen the resilience of our societies and our economies, and to ensure that we do not import vulnerabilities into our critical infrastructure, industries, and supply chains. NATO may not always be on the front line to act, but it must always be the forum for frank discussion and genuine consultation. In fact, NATO is the only place that brings Europe and North America together every day. We have the structures and the institutions in place. What we need is the political will to use NATO, to decide, and when necessary, to act for our shared security. Finally, in a world of greater global competition, where we see China coming closer to us from the Arctic to cyberspace, NATO needs a more global approach. This is not about a global presence, but about a global approach. NATO brings together 30 allies on both sides of the Atlantic. Almost 1 billion people, half of the world's military and economic might, and a network of global partners. As we look to 2030, we need to work even more closely with like-minded countries like Australia, Japan, New Zealand, South Korea, to defend the global rules and institutions that have kept us safe for decades, to set norms and standards in space and in cyberspace, on new technologies and global arms control, and ultimately to stand up for a world built on freedom and democracy, not on bullying and coercion. The challenges that we face over the next decade are greater than any of us can tackle alone. Neither Europe alone, nor America alone. So we must resist the temptation of national solutions. And we must live up to our values: freedom, democracy, and the rule of law. These values are what define us. They are what make us strong as nations and as an alliance. As we continue to compete in a more competitive world, we must keep our democracies strong. My vision for NATO 2030 is not about reinventing NATO. It is about making our strong alliance even stronger. Strong militarily, stronger politically, and more global.
Thanks, Nadia. And Mr. Secretary General, what a terrific set of framing remarks. And you mentioned that your goal in this reflection process is not about reinventing NATO, but about making NATO stronger and more global. And I want to draw you out on what that means in terms of NATO's relationship with China. We've seen a stark deterioration, certainly in the US-China relationship. From where you sit in Brussels, does NATO see China as the new enemy? Thank you.
No, NATO does not see China as the new enemy or an adversary. But what we see is that the rise of China is fundamentally changing the global balance of power. And the NATO leaders, heads of state and government, when they met in London in December, they, for the first time in NATO's history, agreed that NATO has to address the consequences, the security consequences of the rise of China. There are some opportunities because the economic growth of China has fueled economic growth in our part of the world, and it has helped to lift hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. But at the same time, we see that the fact that China soon will have the biggest economy in the world, they will have, they already have the second largest defense budget. They are investing heavily in modern military capabilities, including missiles that can reach all NATO allied countries. They are coming closer to us in cyberspace. We see them in the Arctic, in Africa. We see them investing in our critical infrastructure. And they're working more and more together with Russia. All of this has a security consequence for NATO allies. And therefore, we need to be able to respond to that, to address that. And we need to do that by forging NATO as a stronger political alliance. We need to do that by working together.
How do you see the security architecture developing in a way that it meets the individual and collective needs of the countries, both members of NATO, of the alliance, but also partners? And how do we keep in these circumstances our collective values alive, as they are still seen as one of the main premises for peace? Thank you.
Well, I strongly believe that in uncertain times, we need strong multilateral institutions. And NATO is one of the biggest, most important international institutions we have established. We saw the NATO emerged out of the Second World War, and the whole institution was established to prevent war from ever again also affecting the people in NATO allied countries. And I strongly believe that if there's anything we could learn from the crisis and the decades that has passed since NATO was established, is that when we are faced with uncertainty, then we need strong international institutions. So I think this is the time to strengthen multilateral institutions, to strengthen multilateral cooperation, and including to strengthen NATO. And that's exactly why we have launched NATO 2030, the reflection process, to make sure that we change, that we adapt as the world is changing. And again, since we see that the global balance of power is shifting, we see the rise of China, and compared to China, even the United States is not the biggest one. Soon, China will have the biggest economy in the world. They are leading in investing in a lot of advanced technologies, including parts of artificial intelligence, quantum computing, and so on. Then it's even more important that we stand together, North America and Europe together, because we cannot manage this alone. We need to do this together. So my main message is that when things are difficult, then it's even more important that we stand together, and that we do that, North America and Europe together.
Thank you.
You already mentioned that NATO is increasingly expected to deal with non-military challenges like disinformation, cyber, energy, and climate, and that NATO doesn't necessarily hold all the tools. In addition to the partnerships that NATO has with other countries, for example, in the Asia Pacific, how can NATO update and possibly expand its partnerships network to make sure it has the right partners to tackle these challenges? So I'm thinking along the lines of private sector partners, other international organizations. How can it expand that network? Thank you.
Well, the strength of NATO is that not only do we represent 30 members, close to 1 billion people, half of the world's military might and economic might through the 30 members of NATO, but we are also working with 40 different partners around the world, and we're working with other international institutions like the European Union. We have been able to strengthen that with the UN, and again, since we live in a world which is constantly changing and we are faced with many different threats and challenges at the same time, the importance of working together with partners has become even more critical for NATO, and that's the reason why we are focusing on that. We have seen disinformation and propaganda, as you mentioned. And I strongly believe that the best answer to propaganda is not propaganda. I believe that the truth will prevail. And the facts, the truth is the best way to counter propaganda, disinformation. The aim, of course, of propaganda and disinformation campaigns, as we have seen, for instance, connected to COVID-19, is to undermine trust in our democratic institutions, is to divide allies and reduce our ability to work together. What I believe is that the best way to counter propaganda, and this is in information, that are to provide facts, the truth. And the best way to do that is to have a free and independent press. Journalists asking the difficult questions, checking their facts, checking their stories. That's the best way to make sure that propaganda and disinformation doesn't succeed.
And how do you envisage NATO's relationship with Russia over the next 10 years?
Well, NATO's relationship with Russia is based on what we call a dual track approach. We have seen a more assertive Russia. We have seen a Russia being willing to use military force against neighbors in Georgia, in Ukraine, investing heavily in new modern capabilities, including new nuclear capabilities. They are deploying now a new missile called SSC-8 missile, which can reach European cities, reduces the threshold for potential use of nuclear weapons in an armed conflict, and led to the demise of the INF Treaty, a treaty that banned all intermediate range weapons. And so they're heavily modernizing their nuclear arsenals and also adjusted their doctrines. So we have responded to this not by mirroring what Russia is doing, but by making sure that we have credible deterrence and defense, because that's the best way to prevent the conflict, is to remove any room for doubt, any room for miscalculation about NATO's readiness, willingness to protect all allies. And as long as we provide that deterrence, there will be no conflict, no attack. So that's one part, what we call deterrence and defense. And make sure that we continue to provide that. At the same time, Russia is our neighbor. Russia is there to stay. Russia will not go away. And we believe in dialogue with Russia. We will strive for a better relationship with Russia. We strongly believe in arms control. A new arms race will be dangerous and very costly. And therefore, we continue to work hard for arms control with Russia. And that's part of what we call dual track, the dialogue approach to Russia. And I can just say myself, as a former Norwegian politician, prime minister for 10 years, is that I know that it's possible to talk to the Russians and to actually make agreements with them. We did that, Norway, Russia, for many, many years, on military issues, on energy, on border issues, on many other issues, environment, fisheries, and that was not despite of NATO, but it was because of NATO. NATO provided a platform for us to work with Russia.
Mr. Secretary General, thank you again for these really important comments to make an institution stronger that needs to be strong during these times.